We've all gone through big technology adoption changes. However, what's different now is it's happening faster, and the skills that we are able to build are going away and becoming obsolete faster. These soft skills are going to become even more important as we see AI play bigger roles in our work. The first skill I would say is really important in this environment for a leader is really around emotional intelligence, because we have so much change going on. Humans are working alongside agents. Well, how do you manage that? How do you lead that? And how are we going to manage teams that are this blend? And this is not a like 2030 kind of problem. This is coming up sooner. Okay, now that we know what the transformation should look like, how do we get people to also embrace it? And so we're going to have folks who are really strong at strategically understanding all of our options and being able to narrow those down. Our Masters of Science in Organizational Leadership very much focuses on making sure that we have an opportunity to practice what we're talking about. But what I do think that this generation is very strong at is being open to different perspectives and different ways of thinking in a way that I haven't seen before. When I'm looking at a simulation, I really wanted something that was going to be able to be engaging and really give them the experience of leadership. And I think FLIGBY does a good job of that.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this fantastic event. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here today again for what I believe is really a timely and important conversation. My name is Professor Zoltan Buzady. I teach leadership and decision-making at Corvinus University, Budapest in Hungary, and I serve as the head of the Leadership and Flow Global Research Network. It is my privilege to host this session and kick off this new series actually with you. It's the third session we are having now in what we titled Bridging Theory and Practice. Throughout this series, we aim to explore how leadership development in higher educational context can evolve and what is the best state of the art. We want to move beyond the traditional frameworks, and we want to bring you closer both to theory but also to real-world practice and applications and experiences with those who are experts in this area. Today, it's my great pleasure to welcome our honored guest for today's event, and welcome Barbara Mitchell, professor and a master teacher in leadership and strategy at Northeastern University, another university which we might also talk about, and also founder of Partners for Results Worldwide.com, your consulting and expert company. Barbara is a senior leading expert in learning and organizational development. And as an executive, she has more than 30 years of experience in this domain, in particular in designing and leading global transformation initiatives that really drive measurable business outcomes. Her work sits at the conjunction and intersection of leadership theory and organizational development, business transformation, as I just said, and the performance aspect of what we are supposed to work for in leadership context. So we are going to focus this time more on artificial intelligence, digital transformation aspects in the context of organizations. So Barbara, before we dive into all these trendy and cool new topics, I would like to ask you to share a few words about your professional portfolio, which I just hinted at, about yourself. Where do you work, and what is your consulting firm's profile? Tell us, please.
Oh, wonderful, Zoltan. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and welcome, everyone. So a little bit of background about me, as Zoltan kind of introduced you to it. I think about my career as a portfolio career because not only have I managed large global teams, I had North America, Europe, and parts of Asia Pac, but then I also teach, and I teach at two universities, Boston College and Northeastern University. And then the third hat, if you will, that I wear is a research hat. And I was really fortunate early in my career to have a chance to start my research with Warren Bennis, who gave me a really great foundation around thinking about how we research leadership. currently my focus around leadership is around artificial intelligence and how do we lead in this new environment. So when you think about these three pieces, I see them as very interconnected and also very much tied to some of the flow principles that we're going to be talking about today, in that they really reinforce each other, and I gain feedback from each. So I can find out what's going on within my corporate clients, and I can bring that back into our teaching and research. And then vice versa, often what I'm learning about from my students and from my research flows very nicely into the corporate world. And so I see that reinforcing loop as fundamental to what we are talking about in terms of my job, but also in terms of flow. A little bit about Northeastern University, for those who may not be as familiar. Northeastern University is founded around the concept of experiential learning. And it's one of the organizations, particularly higher ed organizations, that really was embracing artificial intelligence and the way that we're going to think differently about how we teach because of these new tools. And so it has a strong framework and a strong foundation that lends itself very well, I think, to this new world that we're working in.
Okay, and your other institutions where you work, can you tell us a bit about that?
I would like related to. So Boston College, I am the faculty lead for the Business and Leadership Institute, which is a summer program that looks at high-performing high school students in the United States. And we have actually an international group. It's just not within the United States, our focus, but it's around how do we help them be more entrepreneurial, how do we build their leadership and their business skills. And then finally, my organization, which, as Zoltan mentioned, is Partners for Results Worldwide. And that organization really focuses on transformation. And so part of leading the global team was looking at how can we support different country managers in their work so that they are able to make the transformations that they would like to do for whatever that reason is. And so we already have a strong background in transformation. So we would start moving into these digital transformations that we're talking about. It was a really nice fit.
Yes. So we had a pre-call already, and you mentioned actually that the trend is not to invest in AI anymore. Now the trend is actually to get the returns on those investments. So how do you see, what is the state of the art around the world where you work around the tools?
So that's a great question, Zoltan. So when I think about AI, we initially went through a period where everyone was piloting, and it was, I think, kind of a throw everything at the wall and see what fits. And most organizations that I work with now have really evolved that. They no longer are looking at, let's do a lot of fragmented, disjointed pilots, but now we're starting to think about, okay, how are we going to transform our workflows and transform our organizations, being more deliberative in terms of what tools we're agreeing to, what kind of governance structure are we going to have. So it's starting to be more systemic than it was initially. And it's a little bit less around, let's pilot a bunch of different tools. But of course, all of us know that one of the challenges with this environment is how quickly things change. So you could have created an agent base, for example, on Claude, and then all of a sudden Claude comes out with some new tools, or ChatGPT, or any of the other different types of tools that we have. So I think that what I'm doing in my teaching, but I'm also seeing in my organizations, is moving away from this idea of let's capture the next tool, and instead really thinking very differently about, all right, what is it that we need to do? What is the question isn't what kind of tool can we use, but what is the need for the organization? And a recognition that the tools may shift and change. And so what that means is we're going to have to constantly be learning that if you're trying to master a particular tool, it's a little bit difficult to try to accomplish that, because as you're doing this work and gaining mastery, of course, things are shifting again. So that's a very different environment than we've had historically.
Great. So my takeaway or your sentence is, rather than capturing the yet latest tools and run after those, how to integrate them, more strategic, focused implementation and reflective process becomes important. So what are those leadership capabilities which have changed and are going more up in this process? Before we go into all those details, which skills exist, but what is the macro trend?
Yeah, I love that question, because, of course, the first answer you're expecting me to say is digital leadership, digital fluency, and understanding how to use digital tools. But I think that when we're looking at leadership skills, the first skill I would say is really important in this environment for a leader is really around emotional intelligence, because we have so much change going on. I think there was a recent quote that said that within 70% of our jobs will have shifted dramatically within 2030. And I think that's from Price Waterhouse, but other research are showing us the same thing. We're going to have dramatic change at a pace we haven't seen before. So it's different than COVID. It's different than some of the other changes that we've had. It's going to be that transformational. And so as a result, we need emotional intelligence as our foundational leadership skills. And then to round it out, I think the two other ones that I would talk about would be first around adaptability. We think about adaptability, not just how do you adjust to change, but a lot of different levels. How do you demonstrate intellectual adaptability? How do you demonstrate digital adaptability? And so adaptability becomes kind of our buzzword, if you will. And then the third one I would look at is judgment, which, of course, we want to bring leaders in who are building that judgment. But now we're asking them to expand the judgment just beyond their teams. And how do we create our business? Now we have to think about what's the judgment around what we are relying on from these different tools. So do we rely on the answer that came out from AI or not? What guardrails are we putting in place to protect our business? And that ties back to judgment. How are you thinking about introducing it to your teams? So this judgment piece is, I think, going to be one of the key themes that we see around leadership development.
I'm getting into flow myself, having a discussion around all these nuances of, what is judgment and what it is. We're going to do that. So to summarize, it seems to me that your experience is also that rather than this AI tools, this technocratic implementation, it becomes like a human side challenge. It's like a project management, but a very fast-paced project management where the people aspect is actually very often the element where the existing tools fail, and then they come to us, OB people, leadership developers, and say, here we have all these project management institute, whatever tools, but still people are being afraid of adopting those, or they're underutilizing them because they feel bored about that. Is that what you see?
I love what you're saying there, because I think the other piece that ties to that is not just, I think we've historically been looking at tools, and I'm just as guilty as everyone else. I find some new tool and I'm like, ooh, can't wait to go home and try this out. But the reality is that we have to be thinking about what exactly is it that we're asking the organization to do? What data do we have to support this tool? What kind of ways will it improve the way that our productivity is being demonstrated within our organization? And so we're going to have to train everyone away from the tool point of view and much more strategic around the kinds of decisions that we want. What are we looking for in terms of this workflow? And how should it integrate within the other departments? What are the friction spots that we're seeing within the organization? And can this tool change? And so that's going to be a very different way of coming back to these different ways that we're just transforming our organizations, and better understanding, okay, now that we know what the transformation should look like, how do we get people to also embrace it? And what kind of support will they need? So it's multifaceted, as opposed to, I think, what had been historically a scattershot approach to introducing AI.
Yeah. Well, Barbara, this sounds very intellectually interesting and cool. And then I'm thinking some of the viewers might say, yeah, but I work at an educational institution, a university.
Yeah.
So if I take you now down to earth again, into the classroom, right? Tell us how it works for you. How do you bridge yourself these great experiences and insights into a classroom setting? So what do you do? How do you do? What do you do at Northeastern? How does it look at Boston College? And another stance on this is very often, people have sessions around the ethics of AI. Then they have this who are the technological aspect of it. And we are interested in this people and motivation and the groups. So how do these three units work in your practice, in your course?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, we have a master's in science and organizational leadership. And I also teach in our doctoral professional studies. And I think the two things that we're doing in these classes are, I think, first recognizing, and we had a good foundation. So most of our classes already very much meet this need to be experiential. So unlike a lot of leadership classes that you may have taken, our Master's of Science in Organizational Leadership very much focuses on making sure that we have an opportunity to practice what we're talking about. And FLIGBY, the simulation that we've been using for our leadership learning lab, is one of the key tools because it gives you a chance to actually experience being a leader and understanding what the consequences are around that. And many of the elements around FLIGBY tie very much to the AI world, which is I have competing priorities. We're talking about what we call the triple bottom line. So people, profit, and planet. And you have to make decisions that prioritize one over the other. And so part of the class is looking at some of those priorities and trying to figure out, okay, what's different about it? So as we're looking at, particularly in the MSOL, we're thinking about how do we make this more alive for our students so that they can use it right away. In terms of the doctoral program, the class that I'm teaching is an emerging technology class for organizational leaders. And there we're doing something that I think is going to become more the norm as we start to embed our classes in the types of different tools that we'll need. And by that, I mean, we're really asking students to co-create the knowledge with us in this class. So I do have a couple of readings that I include, but I want them to be providing the latest readings that are more appropriate for each week. And we call it Tech Pulse in that particular class. But the intent is for them to continue to gather this information. And then throughout the class, I'm also giving them opportunities to go out and research and talk to folks who are practitioners in the world. And all of this knowledge comes in together and will be put into some kind of tool. Right now, I'm thinking Notebook LM, but that becomes its own, in a way, at a miniature version of a large language model around the course concepts so that they can start to use AI to understand, based on the information of our class, what's really impactful for them, both in terms of the doctoral studies, but also in terms of their work themselves. So I think this idea that we have, passive content is going away, right? The content now is going to be need to be more interactive, that the students themselves will play a big role in this. And as we're thinking about what kind of role they play, we're really modeling what they have to do as leaders, right? We're saying to them, as leaders, I'm going to be constantly looking at information and data and trying to figure out what's the information that I need to bring to it. And it's peer tested because the other peers are reviewing it. And so ultimately they'll walk away from this doctoral class with a playbook that will help them both at their work right now, but also at in their own research. And then I think the third piece that I would change as we start to move into this AI environment around our classes has to do with the reflection component. And most of us are pretty good about building in reflection tools to our classes. But this has become, I think, a really key component to building in the learning around AI. So we're asking students to always journal their work, to learn from the work that they're doing, to create logs around how they were able to take the research that they did and see an impact on it. So those three things are going to, I think, be the shift that we see in higher education as we start to really model and identify what we need to have as skills for higher education.
Right. This tech pulse or techno pulse that sounds intriguing. Is that something you will have on this PhD program, or do you have already samples of what happened on those?
Yeah, so actually it is part of the assignment, and it's really foundational because every student will be required to contribute to Tech Pulse each week around a common theme or a guiding question. And when you put all of these articles together over 15 weeks, you have the benefit of then making sure that the information that you're getting is cutting edge. But it also is of interest to the students because they're able to select which articles they want to put in. And then the teams, as they go about completing the work each week, really building a chapter in this playbook, each team will be responsible for going back and curating that information. What are the critical learnings that we had, and how are we going to represent that? And ultimately, all this gets tied together in what we call the living playbook. And that's a very different design for a class than we would typically see.
Yeah, is that any public, or is this in a closed environment? Why I ask this, because I remember when the first blog sites appeared in the 90s, and at that time people thought that the newspapers will completely disappear, Now we are not calling them newspapers, but news sites. And they thought people would actually pull together these type of news as later then Twitter evolved. But that is public domain. At the same time, there are all these intranet elements where knowledge is being accumulated. So how is this for the Tech Pulse?
For Tech Pulse will be within our class. So the intent is for us to gather resources that will support the learning within the class. And that means that any student who's going through the class has the latest and greatest information about it. But the intent is not to share it in a wider audience. At this point, the intent is for this to be within our class structure and then ultimately within our living playbook. So this will be a unique resource that the students themselves have co-created and then will be a real asset for them going forward.
All right. Let me go a little bit back to FLIGBY, because we got to know each other here in the digital space, but you've been actually in the network, in this ecosystem. How did you come across FLIGBY? I was wondering.
So,
You?
as we think about the simulations, I actually am a faculty advisor for Harvard Business School around their simulations. So I have a pretty good understanding of what's out there. But what I was looking for as we looked at our learning lab was an opportunity to build in. And I think last week, one of your folks who was the guest speaker talked about the importance of figuring out how to do teams well in an asynchronous environment. And so I was looking for some opportunity where students would have similar leadership experiences so we could discuss what were the impacts of their decisions. I wanted a simulation that was modified based on whatever decisions the students had. So it was able to see the impact of the decisions that they made. But I also wanted it to be really engaging. And so I love this idea of having kind of a video journey that the students are going through. And similar to your last guest, what I saw with my classes when we've run it is that the students become really engaged with the people who are part of the FLIGBY journey. And so they tend to say things like, I'm really worried about Jen. She seems like she's really not motivated. She's no longer in the flow. I'm trying to think about how we could really engage her. So they're talking about these characters within FLIGBY as if they're real. And boy, you couldn't ask for a better experience than that from a simulation. So when I'm looking at a simulation, I really wanted something that was going to be able to be engaging and really give them the experience of leadership. And I think FLIGBY does a good job with that.
Thank you for your recommendation. I'm a fan of that also, as you can guess. I've been working with that, and it happened to me exactly the same. I used to teach with Harvard case studies. I wrote my own case studies. I won global awards with that. And the problem is after the analysis, we might have a role play, but we don't know what really the dynamics of that decision or that role play.
Right.
And here there are all these several hours, this 150 decisions, and it goes back and forth. And then we have actually a debate about the video segments in the classroom. So, for example, you just mentioned Jen, and I had recently an executive MBA session where an HR director of a low-cost company had a very different stance on this. The idea was that unless Jen is actually complaining extremely about the misery of the work, there is no need to change. So this is actually quite interesting how organizational routines and industry segment, which is very valid in a low-cost environment, right? You really have to be cut bone, and you try to navigate on the borderline of what is still possible and still make the organization grow financially, but also team-wise. And so we had a debate in the classroom in particular around Jen and how to handle her work problems. Okay.
I love what you said that. Before you move off that thought there, Zoltan, I want to go back to it because I think that's where the richness of the simulation comes in, because very often we'll go through these situations in FLIGBY and maybe the options that come up are not the options that we would choose. And so I think that's a richness that comes with it, because leadership itself is not just a black and white, you make this decision, you get this result. There's often consequences that you hadn't even anticipated. And so the richness that comes with this exercise is that the students themselves are seeing the situation in different ways. And that makes our conversations really strong when we get into our discussion boards, or for in class, we can have those conversations as well. The fact that it is helping you think differently, that someone else is going to review Jen in a different way. I think opens up our eyes around how we then have to think about the different perspectives within our organization. Also, we're looking at different competing demands. So it may be people are often aligned by culturally what their organization focuses on. So that organization sounds like it might be more profitability focused and less people focused. And what are the impacts of that in terms of the culture and the motivation? And then I think certainly within the current generations are very much motivated by sustainability. And so building that into the simulation, I think makes a difference as well. So I am really excited to hear you say that there were different points of view. To me,
Yeah.
that's where we want to go in terms of these classes.
I asked them to replay the second or third time in trios, three people together, and they must take jointly a decision. And that is a hell of a debate going on. And then, sometimes they come very late to session and they said, we couldn't stop it. We were talking about own organizations and our own values, and we shifted away from that particular topic. We can create actually like a debating club around those aspects. And I want to have such a debating club with you because you mentioned that you viewed last session, number 2, and we had a discussion there with our colleague on the decision whether night harvest technology, which Larry is proposing, should be introduced. And then there is Chris, the production manager, the winery manager, the vineyard manager, and you are the general manager. So what was your view? Because you had actually a very interesting aspect on, you would have done it slightly differently.
Yeah, and in fact, it wasn't even one of the options. So so the situation, just to step back and give folks the background, if you were not part of the session 2, this is a situation where you're the general manager and you happen to be walking through the winery, and one of the employees comes up to you. He's not a direct report to you. There's somebody in between, and says, I have this really innovative idea. I've read about how important it is for harvest to be done at night, and it makes a big difference in terms of the grape and what happens ultimately to the outcome of the product. And I'd like you to approve it. And so the answers, I don't remember the specific answers, but the answers are all around, would you approve it or not? So the focus is around innovation. But I heard it differently. I heard it as, okay, you're brand new as a general manager, and you now have an employee who's trying to skip over his manager. And so I would have liked an option that said, let's bring in your manager and have a conversation about what that fit would be. So when you and I were talking about it, I said, I didn't see it quite the same way. I was trying to make sure that we had really built in the whole communication loop, because I, as someone who's managed largely a team of 60 globally, and the last thing I want to do is have somebody skip over their manager and make a decision on the manager's behalf when the manager should have been involved all along.
Yes. So this is one of those trade-offs. I think there is also in AI decisions. Is that something which we want to introduce because it's going to drive the numbers? Is that going to drive the technology, or is that something which is supported by the incumbent colleagues? And I do think the right answer for this decision is exactly as you suggest, to consider the flow of his superior who's in charge, and him being more of a logical thinker, a workaholic type of person. He actually needs to be taken on board, that he's not overruled by your quick decision, although it is good maybe for the wine products or for the sustainability dimensions. So there is this balancing between business aspects, which on the triple bottom line would be the profit, and then there is the next one, the people, but this one actually is also good for the planet. So in this case, you have 2 versus the middle layer. So this is where all these issues come along. And technical.
And, as you think about that connection, Zoltan, to AI, we are now going to be having new conditions where we won't have just the employees that we're thinking about, but we're looking at, potentially agents. And it's already happening where humans are working alongside agents. Well, how do you manage that? How do you lead that? And so that's going to be, I think, one of the key questions that we're going to have to really be thinking about as the future for leaders is, how do we blend this technological human combination and make sure that everyone is still feeling engaged and respected and valued as part of our organizations? And what does that mean when we start to turn more and more information over to AI? It's interesting because the IBM argument used to be there's always a human in the link, right? That somewhere along the line, a human is making a decision. But as these tools get more advanced, you may find yourself already using certain tools, and you tend to take at face value what the agent is coming back and telling you. And so what guardrails are we going to put in around that? And how are we going to manage teams that are this blend? And this is not a like 2030 kind of problem. This is coming up sooner. Most organizations I talk with are increasingly relying on the idea of having agents complete a lot of work, and that will be a significant part of our workforce in 2028. And so that's something we have to start thinking about. How are we going to lead with that?
Yes. So, Barbara, FLIGBY, once you play it, you get this leadership skills profile, which we're going to talk about in a second. Currently, with my colleagues here at Corvinus, we were having first ideas how we could get various AI platforms play FLIGBY, and so we could measure the leadership skills profile of those platforms. At the moment, we can't find an interface that this movie-based, high context, rich nuances can be actually transformed into the decisions which the humans have to do.
Right.
However, the advantage of FLIGBY, I think, is that it is non-intrusive profiling based on the decisions you actually take. So sometimes companies say that here is FLIGBY, please play it, you will enjoy it. And instead of us having an assessment center with so-called experts who have their own yardstick and their own cultural embeddedness, we want you to play FLIGBY and be measured like others just by the algorithm which is in it. So when there is a candidate, and I'm asking Zad, my colleague, to show candidate number 3 now. This is a person, for example, an anonymous person, and this is one of the results after the FLIGBY simulation. I have chosen the top 6 skills of a person, and I have also added the least utilized skills, the skills which the person has used less in 150 decisions. So we see a dark blue bar with hashtag number 1, which means this is the first game round's result of this person, candidate number 3. And if this person then replays for the second time, hashtag number 2 appears, and for the third time, hashtag number 3, and so on. Then there is a brownish ochre-colored bar, which is the total population of FLIGBY. It's around 22,000 players worldwide. We can call it a benchmark. Sometimes companies have, or schools or MBA programs have a group benchmark. In this case, I have not switched it on. And then there is a light blue, which is the percentile ranking. It's like a rank order of this person. So this person is particularly strong in involvement. 85% of the decisions where involvement would have been relevant, this person has chosen. So that's why it's 85% as a result. It's far stronger than the 71% of usually people from all over the world. And with this 85%, he or she is number 82 amongst 100. So 91 players would have a lower score behind this person. And then we see emotional intelligence, analytical skills, so it's a logical thinking. Then we have the skill of being able to organize a process, to build an engagement with the team employees. And the 6th one is diplomacy. It means that the person can actually set up processes that 2 conflicting parties get closer to each other and come to mutual decision. The least used skills of this person relatively to the other skills this person has, the 29, is communication. Then stakeholder management, which means looking after what the family owners want or the community owners. This person has then a lower score in assertiveness, not so good in team management, teamwork management. So this is around the team dynamics, and does not drive on intuitive thinking, which is actually interesting or obvious in this case, not obvious, but the opposite of this high score on analytical thinking. So another question to you, what would you advise to this person if you would be a career consultant and would want to work in this field of AI? Which of the skills would be relevant, would create flow? Which skills are redundant and create the threat of being bored? And which skills maybe should develop because they're actually necessary in AI? So long question, long expose, but what your expertise? Now you talk.
So, Zoltan, thank you so much for organizing this information, because I think it helps for people to understand what each one of these elements are, because you
Mhm.
see the rows and the lines and the people, and sometimes it's hard for folks to look at it. The other thing I would add, though, is when I am helping people understand their FLIGBY results, I think it's worth noting up front that a low score does not necessarily mean that your skills are poor. A low score could mean that you didn't have a chance, because of the way you played the game, to demonstrate that particular skill. So I think the first step, as we're starting to understand these results, would have to be, okay, is this matching what I know about myself and other feedback that I've gotten? The other thing that I often have folks do is look at clusters of skills. And so if you look at this particular candidate, Sad, could you put that back up? Thanks. So if you look at this particular candidate, for example, you see building engagement as one of their top 5 strengths, and yet you see team management being one of their top low strengths. In fact, they fall below the 13th percentile in terms of looking at global people. A global population has also taken FLIGBY. So when we're looking at clusters that we organize these clusters around, I think it gives us a little bit more information around what are the real weaknesses and what are the opportunities to continue to develop versus what are the strengths. The other thing that I look at is the percentiles themselves, because what I'm trying to understand with the percentile is not only this idea of is this a strength, but is this a development area? Is it a development area that is relevant to this particular work I'm doing? So I could be really low, for example, at stakeholder management, but my work doesn't require me to do a lot of stakeholder management. So I think there's some caveats before we jump into the detail. In terms of AI, why I like this particular profile that you had shared with me before was around some of the key skills that we were talking about earlier. So the first is that very strong emotional intelligence, the ability to be analytical, which I think is going to be critical as we start to build guardrails around the data and understand, is this information valid or not? So those 2 skills are really important. And then how do we organize the data that's coming in so that we can figure out whether this is helpful? If you've ever tried some of the large language models like Chat or Claude, you can get inundated with information. And so as a leader, trying to figure out how I use this information to improve my business or improve my workflows, I have to be pretty organized about what this data is telling me, because it can give you lots of information. You go down a rabbit hole and it's not helpful. Now, when we're looking at the components around people management, and we talked a little bit already about emotional intelligence, but this idea of building engagement and involvement and diplomacy, those are really important as you think about how we're going to engage folks into what is a tremendous change to their workflow, and how are we thinking about making sure that they're comfortable with this shift. So overall, this seems like a great candidate for someone who is going to be a leader who is required to do and use AI tools. Let's look at some of the bottom 5, though, if you could. So communication, we see them actually around the 34th percentile. So that's about where I'm starting to get a little concerned if this was something that was going to be critical for their role. And let's face it, any leadership role, communication is going to be really important. So what catches my eye with those bottom 5, with the caveats we talked about earlier, is certainly around communication. Stakeholder management, Dan, now expand that beyond what we're thinking about with stakeholders. So normally I'm thinking about, maybe cross-functional stakeholders or industry-wide stakeholders, or maybe I have a government role with stakeholders. Now we need to add a new stakeholder, and that stakeholder is the agents that are going to be working and including AI. And so if that's going to be the case, they're going to have to build some some tools up and some skills around that, because they're now in the 28th profile, if my eyes read correctly.
Yes.
And then we talked about the team management as well. The last 2 are intuitive thinking. And if I'm reading it correctly, it's a little bit.
It's teamwork management.
And what's the one on the right? Assertiveness. There we go. So, and the intuitive management, I think, is also going to be something that we'll have to see what level of work they're doing around these different skills, because it may be that the role itself doesn't require them to have a large role around intuitiveness, particularly if we can overcome that with some of their analytical skills and their organizational skills. And then assertiveness, we're going to have people who are comfortable turning to us and saying to us, I don't think this data is right. And as a leader, that can be really hard because you're dealing with really short time frames and deadlines and competing priorities. And it's always beneficial. And I truly value someone who can raise their hand and say, I don't agree with the way that we're going. We have to rethink that. So I would need someone else on my team to bring that assertiveness component back in because this person is a little bit low in that.
Yes, this is exactly what the advantage is. If you have a skill which you have underutilized, either you replay the second round in FLIGBY to get more sensitivity. Where is this skill? And technocratic background people, which I always say, like engineering, finance,
Right.
IT, they usually get a no flow out of being told, be more innovative or be more intuitive. They try and they don't get it.
Right.
So in this case, I recommend that they choose a peer group person who has a high score in intuitive thinking. And when they replay, they let that other person stay quiet until the person who needs to develop intuitive thinking comes up with the solution in the game. Here, intuitive thinking would have been appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
Then they hear from each other, aha, this is it, now I got it. Right? So they don't try it out in the real world. Okay. If we move on to the next slide, where we see the 29 skills by and large.
Mm-hmm.
These are the 29 skills Professor Csikszentmihalyi, the flow professor, has identified. We call them the FLIGBY skills because they're measured in FLIGBY, but we can call them also the good business principle skills, which he has identified. So this is coming back a little bit to your three areas, which are
Mm-hmm.
the most important. And you have mentioned first this emotional intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly included here. It is a skill also in FLIGBY number 11, emotional intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And from my perspective, it's also rather close to active listening. So if you really want to find out what are the emotions of the person, you have to listen. What are the inner drivers? What are the inner motivations or hopes as well?
Mm-hmm.
So they can be actually, I think, pretty well linked. But you know the skills pretty well as well. So I'm curious to ask you for the next one, which is called adaptability, which you mentioned at various levels, the digital and the intelligence level. Which one would you associate with these out of these 29 with?
Yeah, so when I think about adaptability, there are a couple of things that I'm thinking about. First is, this openness to being able to make shifts or changes around it. And so I think that that openness is really reflected very nicely, perhaps in the future orientation or prioritization. Those might play a really important role. But also in adaptability, I see not just this idea that I'm comfortable with change, but also that I'm intellectually comfortable with adaptability, because what that means is I'm comfortable with someone pushing back on me and being able to challenge me. And so there are some competencies around that ability to be comfortable with challenge. Maybe that's a little bit around conflict management, because that's something that folks don't necessarily have. Also, business-oriented thinking would play a key role there. And then the last piece around adaptability, which I would say is very much content specific, is understanding when we're talking about adaptability, it's not just the normal adaptability that we've experienced before. I think I said, this is change not at the COVID level. This is constant change that we're going to be experiencing for a very long time. And so we're going to need folks as part of that to be comfortable with being able to gather information, to be able to be comfortable with strategic thinking, but also entrepreneurship and managing the risk as we talk about these new ways of working, because we have to build in this governance part. If we don't have any kind of governance, I think it ties to the ethics question that you were having before, but if we don't have governance guardrails built in, then we're going to run into problems fairly quickly with it.
Right. We can't make a big nuance conference around all those skills, but I get the paletta, the portfolio of what is around adaptability, and I personally feel it's also related to something like empowerment, or we call it the ability to create engagement and trust,
Right.
so that people who are around you, they have their own insights and they come to you, and you adapt actually to their reality. So it's this, let's say, laissez-faire or democratic way of adapting to the reality, rather than saying, this is what I had planned, this is how it should be done, and actually I'm co-creating something, and
Right.
this is the way of being adaptable. What about the third one, which is and this was actually one of the questions we got about this, adaptability, so I hope we explore that partly.
Yeah.
What about judgment? It's very important to make good judgments. I would think that's around analytical thinking, right?
Mhm. Right. I
But
agree with that.
what
Maybe a
what
little bit of engagement and trust as well.
see? Yeah, so it's that component of the team get them on board. Yes.
And maybe a little social responsibility, I think, might play a role as we're thinking about judgment. But also, I would say the conflict management skills, because,
Oh,
we talked about that in terms of adaptability. But when we were looking at the profile that you had showed earlier, you're looking at someone who needs to be able to raise their hand and say, this isn't the right way to go. And that's going to be more important for us than ever. And so I know we've talked about that already, but I see that ability as one of the key talents I want on my team.
yes. Zad, if you can show us the next one. I work with these. I believe that flow is a universal leadership principle. I actually discovered flow as the source of being creative. And
Mhm,
I do think that even in an AI setting of any change, we need to have this inner psychological strength and capital, which is freed up whilst being in flow. And for me, these are the four most universal skills. The first one is strategic thinking,
mhm,
because one should, as a leader, be able to set the longer term goal on why we are doing all these activities at work, in the technology, in the investments. The second one he identified is feedback, because feedback from the activity creates the flow.
mhm,
This, I think, is a little bit closer actually to also to adaptability in this sense. And even
mhm,
more is skill number 24 and 4, which are the two dimensions of this, what he calls balance between opportunities or challenges and skills on the other hand. So personal
mhm.
strength, being able not to overload a person with a task if the skills are low, and not to underload them as well. So it's quite interesting that once you have your own view on how reality is, how leadership should be, and you, as an expert, Barbara, in AI, you have your own three major building blocks. So have
Mhm,
I for flow leadership. Then we can draw out from these different numbers, which we have seen on the first slide, uh, um, pools, or how you call them, packets,
plus, yeah,
clusters,
around them.
clusters, and that really enables people to face the change there's there, and also actually to experience joy and
Yeah.
flow in being in their work. Okay.
I want to, before you move on, Zoltan, I want to just highlight the strategic thinking one, because
Mhm,
we talked about it, and I know we linked that to the clear goals element of flow. But that's
mhm,
a really important skill that we're asking folks to do in the AI environment, because you now have so many different directions that you can go. How are you going to use your team's time? We were talking about how it's shifted now from going away from let's everybody pilot to now let's be a little bit more organized and focused around how we're rolling out development. And so we're going to have folks who are really strong at strategically understanding all of our options and being able to narrow those down, because one of the nice things about AI and these models that are coming out is we're able to personalize the information more. But on the same token, because it can modify things so quickly, we can get inundated, I think, very quickly with the different approaches we want to take and all the different information. So I
yeah.
did want to highlight how important strategic thinking was.
Barbara, it's I'm in flow talking with you about this, because there are these four different time horizons which FLIGBY measures. The
Right.
decisions which have a very short impact, we call them entrepreneurial or risk-taking.
Mhm,
Decisions which have an impact within half a year. So in AI, maybe people are on the project and within half a year it needs to be implemented. The
mhm,
next one, decisions affecting the winery's performance within a business year. So we call that business-oriented thinking.
mhm,
Something you, Barbara, have mentioned, that AI becomes more profit driven. It needs to be shown, not in long term. Then we have the strategic thinking, which is between 2 and 3 years. And actually, that's interesting that you emphasize that because things can be customized so much, we need to have the longer trajectory on what we are going to do, what we are going to work for, not just for half a year, not for 1 year, but actually sort of foresee what there is after that. And the fourth one in FLIGBY is future orientation, which is more around the values, more around why this company is actually existing, for the society, for the people who are around it, who work there as well, on a more longer term dimensions.
I love what you're saying there, Zoltan. And just let me add to that a little bit, which is the other thing that we're going to find is that, remember, our skills are going to be used in different ways. A lot of the things that we may be doing in our work right now are no longer going to be in our area of expertise or are required to complete. And so as you're looking at that balance that is so important for flow, when we're trying to understand, do you have the right skills versus being able to make sure that you are able to also do things that are engaging to you. Well, now all of a sudden that balance has shifted, and some of the stuff I might have loved is now automated. So how are we going to think about making sure people continue to feel like they're in flow because they have this balance, that balance between the skills and what they love to do? And it may really shift as we start automating some of these different workflows in our work overall.
Great. So now we go to the questions, which you also see on your side panel. I'm going to read them out for the viewers. First one is from Kathy, and it's to you. So,
hi, Kathy. Thank you so much for sharing this. So, Zoltan, do you want to read it, and then I can?
Barbara, you mentioned that competing priorities are one of the most important aspects of experiential learning. How do you see Gen Z performing in this area? Many of them seem less prepared to deal with the consequences of their own decisions. No offense intended, just something I have observed personally. Do you think that this is a generational issue, or more of a result of how they have grown up and they have learned?
It's so interesting, Kathy, that you bring this up, because I am so lucky that I have a chance to work with high school students every summer as part of our business and leadership institute. And it's interesting to see how they think about things very differently, because, of course, they've had very different experiences. For many of them, the way that the world shut down for COVID dramatically impacted how they see the world and what are some of the things that they feel like they can put their arms around as these are going to always be true for me. So it's interesting that you've observed that they don't necessarily understand the consequences of their decisions. And I wonder if part of that is because the world was shut down during their developmental time, that perhaps they didn't have to deal as much with consequences, or they dealt with it in a different way than we had before. So it may very well be that the newer generations are looking at this in a different way. They have different priorities, I think, than some of the older generations do. And so that may also play a role. Their version of consequences are different than our version of consequences. I haven't seen any studies that really support that decision-making consequences are a big difference, but I really can see your point around this in terms of the folks who are coming through my summer programs, and how do they look at what kinds of next step they want to do and what the impact does of it. The other may also be that we are, as you get older, you start to experience consequences more. And it may be that this generation just hasn't necessarily experienced consequences in the same way. But it's an interesting question. I'll keep more of an eye on it as we work together this summer.
Yes, me for my part, although the question wasn't directed directly to me, but I feel the same. Very often in a case method, I have to say what I think actually is the best decision in the sense of intellectually or strategically. And then I get in the reviews students saying the professor always pushed his idea. Well, I didn't push my idea. I pushed what is in the teaching notes written by Harvard colleagues and myself. So they very often actually disengage in intellectual debates as soon as it becomes deep thinking in terms of Kahneman's work and Kahneman's work of system 2 type of thinking, where they have to put in more ideas. Is this true? But putting this aside, using FLIGBY, this is really good, because then I say, okay, now you replay and you're going to try out yourself. You didn't agree with this and that statement. Try to play it the other way around. So the overall target of winning the Spirit of the Wine Award, the KPIs, makes them to fiddle around. So they're comfortable with this short-term trying out of it.
I like what you're saying there. And I guess the other thing I would add that I have seen a big difference around is that the generations that come through our BC program, and we're very lucky because it's such a competitive program, it's very difficult to get in. So for every one student I bring into business and leadership, I have to turn 4 away. So I've recognized that it may not be perhaps representative of the entire generation. But what I do think that this generation is very strong at is being open to different perspectives and different ways of thinking in a way that I haven't seen before. You know, they're very supportive of each other, and they're very supportive of having different points of view represented in the class. And I've loved that. I think that's a real asset for them.
Mm-hmm. Dave is asking us or you, what do you see as the biggest challenge AI brings to leadership? We talked around that. But he asks then, is it primarily about technology adaptation or more about the leading of the people aspect through uncertainty, change, and this shifting expectations?
Dave, you're going to hate part of my answer, which is it's a little bit of both. I think what's different, because we've all gone through big technology adoption changes. However, what's different now is it's happening faster, and the skills that we are able to build are going away and becoming obsolete faster. So that's a very different experience. However, one of the things that we end up focusing on, because it's such a technology-driven focus, is that we're coming back and talking about how do we implement the technology, and not necessarily how are the people who are going to be implementing the technology feeling about this, and can they give us some insights about how this is going to work or it's not going to work. Is this something that we should be doing, or should we be using our resources in a different way? And so I would answer that it's both, but we're probably better at managing the technology piece and not as good at thinking about the impact it's going to have on folks who are not only seeing their jobs dramatically shift, but they're getting a lot of messaging out there about what the future of work looks like and what the impact is going to be to them for their careers. So I think as a leader, I'm now focusing much more on how do I help my team understand these shifting expectations, understand the shifting priorities, understanding how their work is changing, and can I help them make those changes to develop the skills that they need to and be comfortable with them. Because I think we're seeing a lot of instability, and it's impacting folks in their engagement levels.
Last brief question.
I know we may have skipped over Max before we get into Phil. Did we want to pop back and pick up Max?
Answer around this adaptability is a fundamental trait of AI era in leadership. Do you think that adaptability can be taught, or is it more of a mindset rather than a learnable skill?
So I don't know how you feel about this, Zoltan, but for me, it feels like a little bit of both there as well, because certainly I can help you build skills that enable you to be more adaptable and be able to shift around whatever we're currently focusing on and the change that needs to happen. But if you are, and that's a little bit to what I was just speaking about earlier, if you are really dead set against this, then it doesn't matter what skills I try to build, the adaptability isn't going to be there. And so part of our work is going to have to be as leaders to understand what their role is going to be in the organization and how they are going to continue to have a strong career, but be open to the shifts and changes. The other challenge, and I think I've talked about this throughout, is that because the pace is so much faster and because our skill sets are now going to be wiped away very quickly, we're going to have to get people comfortable with that rate of change in a way that we didn't have to before.
Yes, my thought on this is that when people think that they are cannot learn something and their resistance, it's around this mental state of being in worry or even worse in anxiety. So by teaching them this very simple flow theory with the skills and challenge balance, then they actually start to realize, aha, I need to develop my skills, because then I will move out of what I think I'm not going to able to learn. So first teaching the overall concept of flow and the mental states helps people to develop any or almost all skills gradually, because then they fear in their body, in their behavior, this anxiety. And by looking at the flow radar, they see that there has something to do with reducing the challenge, which is difficult, but by also increasing the skills. And then they at least mentally, cognitively are aware of how the process would work. And then comes afterwards the implementation of developing and learning skills in order to be more adaptable. That's it. And then Phil asks, do you think AI could ever become a better, so again, do you think AI could ever become a better leader than humans in certain areas? Do you believe that human leadership qualities, empathy, judgment, trust, ethical responsibility will become irreplaceable?
So this is a really hot topic right now, isn't it? We hear a lot about what are the critical skills that folks need to have. And I do a class actually at BC that talks about the future of work. So from my point of view, we won't ever see a situation where AI becomes such a strong leader that they are able to replace human leadership. I think we're at a point where I think we're going to agree that empathy, judgment, trust, ethical responsibility, these are all skills, emotional intelligence, these are all skills that that humans can bring that at this point we don't see AI doing. Now, I don't know what the future is. I don't have a crystal ball for it, but I think that's one of the things that really is going to be important as we start to help people understand what the future of work is going to be. Because these skills that we just talked about, these soft skills, are going to become even more important as we see AI play bigger roles in our work. And it's what's going to differentiate those who can really leverage AI the best and those who I think are going to be left behind. So we're going to need these human elements of skills. And that really maps to a lot of the thinking that's been done by Northeastern's team, particularly our President Ayun, who really thought a lot about this topic, and he's published on this and talks about how important empathy and judgment and some of these other humanistic skills are going to be as we continue for the future of work. So from my point of view, I don't see AI ever replacing or becoming a better leader than humans in all the areas.
Yes. Well, Barbara, dear colleague, one of the features of recognizing flow mental state is that time elapsed and run away. So I think this has happened, at least for me, I guess for you, maybe for the viewers as well. So we're coming to an end. I'm going to announce the next stage of this webinar series. It will be on May 27th, same time. And the focus topic number 4 is closing the gap between academia and industry, leading with insights, ethics, and adaptability in the age of AI. Our guest will be Howard Farrow. He's professor and director of the graduate leadership programs at the Albert Magnus College. He's bestseller author, speaker, and known for the leadershipdoc.com page also. And we are going to talk with him around what does it truly mean for a graduate to be work ready instead of future ready, work ready. How should higher education adopt and prepare AI ready leaders in a technical, practical sense? And we're going to focus on collaboration with industry for shaping the future talent. So I invite viewers to join us then and to formulate their questions as they arise. And for now, Barbara, thank you very much for having been here.
And thank you so much for having me, and thank you for everyone who joined and also for asked questions. We really have enjoyed working with you, and it's been an honor to have a chance to be part of this session.
Thank you very much. May the flow be with you.